And we are live. Okay, welcome to Q&A day 2. So again, my name is Megan Peters. You guys should all know who I am right now. But today with me, I have 2 wonderful panelists, and we're going to talk about today's tutorials, but also any questions that you guys have about modeling and the modeling process. And so we can do some brief introductions, and then I'm going to do a quick poll to start. So actually, I'm going to put this up while we do the introductions. And so you guys take a look at the polls button at the bottom of your screen. So I just want to see, we talked a lot about the train illusion today, and I want to see whether anybody has ever experienced this. So go ahead and click buttons while we do some introductions. And so now we can have an introduction from Hong. Hong, can you tell us about you?
Sure. Let me share the screen.
Sure, yeah.
So
yeah, awesome. Here, so let's make that big. Perfect.
Okay, I'm an assistant professor at Peking University, and I use modeling, of course, but I also use behavioral and neural image experiment to extend human cognition and decision making. And what I'm really interested is to reinterpret classical psychological and behavioral phenomenon from a decision theoretic approach. That means everything is decision making. So a few keywords: Bayesian decision theory, uncertainty, probability distortion, perception action, attention, decision making, and bounded rationality. So basically, I'm interested in modeling human higher cognition, like how people decide, and visual and motor uncertainty, as well as in economic decision and risk.
Awesome, thanks. And actually, this is really exciting for me because Hong and I don't think if we've ever met in person, it was, a completely different life before COVID. But Hong, you and I have a lot in common in our interests. And so I think this is going to be a really fun discussion today where we talk about visual and vestibular signals and everything. Yeah, it's going to be cool.
Oh, actually, I found you and Larry Maloney had taught a summer school together before.
That's right.
I did a postdoc with Larry Maloney.
Okay, well, there you go.
That's why I'm so familiar.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I actually, last year at Cosmo, which is one of the summer schools that was also co-founded by Gunnar Blohm and Paul Schrader and Conrad Cording, who also helped co-found Neuromatch Academy. And I was an instructor at Cosmo with Larry, and Larry was a wonderful person to teach with. So now it all makes sense. Yeah, Larry was lovely. That was great. Cool. Okay, so C, why don't you tell us a little bit about you?
Okay, so my name is Si Wu. I'm also from Peking University. So I don't know why today with 2 panelists from the same university. Okay, anyway, my background is theoretic physics. After graduation, I changed to computational neuroscience. I'm interested in a lot of stuff of modeling and computational stuff in computational neuroscience, like neural population coding, continuous attractive neural networks, and Bayesian theory, multi-sensory integration. Anyway, a lot of stuff because I have been in this field for many years, more than 20 years. And recently, I'm also working on some brain-inspired computing. So try to apply some models and algorithms we found in the neural system, try to apply to solve some applications. So this is my first time. I'm very happy to attend this neural match discussion.
Yeah, I think this will be really fun. So I'm seeing that we've got some echo going on. So I'm going to try muting a couple people, but when you want to talk, can you unmute yourself? And then that way maybe we can kill the echo. It's only when Hong and Megan are speaking. I hear it too. Okay, see, I'm going to mute you.
Okay.
And we'll see, is this better? Are we getting echo now? Are we okay? All right, I think we may have fixed it. So C, unfortunately, we're going to have to keep you on mute but unmute yourself and jump in, okay? All right, cool. Super. So let's take a look at the poll briefly, just to kind of get you guys thinking about the illusion that you talked about today and the tutorials. And so in the poll, we're asking, have you ever experienced the train illusion? And did you wonder why it happened? And it looks like most people are saying yes, and I totally thought I knew the answer, but now I am not so sure. And that's great, because that means that the models that we are talking about today and the model that we talked about today, which sort of got it right, but didn't quite get it right, maybe gets you kind of thinking about why some models work better than others. How about you guys, Hang and C? Have you guys ever experienced the train illusion?
Well,
like the motion
not much.
Not much? No, really? So when like you're sitting on the train, you don't like, and like the train next to you starts to move, you don't feel like you're moving? Maybe you have a very strong vestibular sense.
Well, the truth is, the last time I took a train, well, not very, a few months ago, maybe last year. So, but now we don't have like many trains coming together. So when I'm trained, I just did not notice.
True. Yeah, that makes sense. There's a couple people in here who have never experienced the train illusion at all. So for those of you who said I've never experienced, next time you are on a train, you're in a station, like see if this happens to you. I think it'll be really interesting. All right, cool. So before we get into the interesting questions that you guys are all asking right now, I think that it would be good if we do our reflection. So I have also figured out how to share my screen. Sorry about the tech difficulties yesterday, everybody. But I'm going to go ahead and share this now so that we can do our reflections. And I think this will do it. No, that's not it. Sorry. Give me 1 second. Technology. It's always difficult. All right. Here, how about this? Okay. So we've got this going. So you guys have seen this slide maybe before, and if you've watched some of the other videos. But what we want now is, again, to take just a couple minutes to really think about, have you experienced the illusion? You thought you knew the answer. What have you learned now today that you didn't know before? And so we'll put the links in the chat as well. And so if someone wants to retype those links into the chat, then I don't have to do it. That's great. Or you can go find this information on NeuroStars. And so I'll remind you that if you have your interactive students link here, you can go there, and then that'll give you the information here. There's going to be like some surveys and information that's there. So let's type these into the chat, and then we can do just a couple minutes here where we think about today's lesson and today's like tutorials, which were a lot more theoretical than the ones that we did before. So I'm going to type these into the chat here. And if anyone wants to do the observer one, then you can do that for me, and I don't have to type both of them. So let's do that. Please go there. And as you guys may have remembered before, from yesterday, these are really important because they also help us take a temperature on how you guys are doing, how you guys are getting along, whether you're, having fun, having a good time. And so I think, yeah, please just take a couple minutes to do that, and then we can kind of get going on chit-chatting about some of these questions here if you want. Hang and C, you guys can also see the questions if you click the Ask a Question box. And so we can pick some of these and go through them. And we usually start kind of at the top, and we'll see which ones, get upvoted, and we can go from there. But let's take a moment here to read through a couple of these. You guys are all doing your reflections, right? I hope. Can you say yes in the chat if you're doing your reflections so I know that you're there? We want to make sure that you guys are having a good time. So please do this. Anybody home? Yeah, cool. All right. So sweet. Wonderful. Thank you. Okay. So it looks like we have a couple good questions here. This is great. And you guys can jump in and answer questions too. Like it's not totally my job. The whole point here is that we're going to have a really fun discussion. So,
so shall we go from the highest votes question?
Yeah, we can do that. Let's give the students just a couple more, like one more minute to do their reflections. It's a real short survey, but we just want to make sure that they're having a good time. And so these surveys, just so you guys know, these surveys, we're asking them to think about the knowledge that they came into the day with, and then the knowledge that they left the day with, and kind of to compare them and see what's different and how it's changed, and how maybe you can apply this stuff, this knowledge, to the questions that they want to answer in their science. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started on some of these questions. So let's start at the top.
So I cannot see the question. Is that right?
Oh yeah, if you click on the Ask a Question button at the bottom, you'll be able to see them.
Oh, okay. There are 11 questions now. Okay.
Yeah. So let's do the first question. Why the vestibular signal is an acceleration, not a voltage like an optic signal. So this is a question about representations. That's pretty cool. So I'm going to take down the slides here so we're big again. Is that okay, guys? We can take down the slides.
Mm-hmm.
And so the first question is, why is the vestibular signal an acceleration, not like a voltage? So this is really about kind of what what it's representing, and not so much like the actual raw signal, right? So it probably is like, actually a voltage, in the sense that the neurons are actually coding, they're actually spiking, like this is actually like information that is being passed by typical neural signals. But it's about how it's interpreted by the brain. Do you guys have any thoughts about that type of question?
Well, I don't consider myself as a perception person, more like a decision-making person. So decision-making is about to get signals and integrate the signals. But for this question, I just have some like lay person thought. Like, I think our perception or sensory motor systems, they have the representations is just mirror the outside world. It's like for vision, visual world is a map, and we have all kinds of references. So you can have, say, when you move, you have here is the train and here's the window. So you have references, but for vestibular signal, I don't think we have such references that's there. And it's something that naturally come with like change, and also probably, I don't know what's cause and what's effect, but if it's noisy, then it probably makes little sense to accumulate it. And more is like instantaneous signal. So that's kind of lay person thought.
Yeah,
Not sure whether it's answer.
I think the point of these questions too, like we want to answer the questions, of course, guys, like we want to answer your questions, but we also want to chat a little bit about what they mean in the bigger picture framework. See, did you want to? I'm muting you. Sorry, I keep.
Okay. Yeah. No problem. I open by myself. Okay. Actually, this is also my question. So although I did some work about the integration of visual and vestibular singular, but I starting from that, or the heading direction singular is already there. So I don't know, but I guess is that it may be because for vestibular system, when we think is a force, so that's why it comes to the acceleration. But for me, I also know that vestibular signal is not only acceleration, can also be speed. Am I right, Megan?
Yeah, well, we talked about this in the tutorials a little bit today, where you know, once you've integrated the acceleration signal, it kind of comes to represent velocity in that way. And so, yeah, it can, like, the result of integrating the instantaneous vestibular signal ends up being a representation of speed. And so now it's going from, like, this is voltage, this is a representation of acceleration, this is a representation of speed, because the brain is able to do all that.
But the raw signal can't be speed, isn't it? Because we can't perceive speed if we move with a constant speed. So
Yeah.
It's only acceleration we can perceive in physics.
Yeah, so it's like the interpretation or the inference that the brain does as a result of having integrated the vestibular signal ends up being this kind of abstract representation of speed. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. All right, let's do the next one then. All right, why does increasing the window size shift the curves? Oh yeah, we've got some answers too. I think what this is referring to is the sliding window approach, right? The idea that changing the size of the window in the moving average, the sliding average, changes the way that the curves look. And so this is really, it's just you're averaging over a larger area or a larger period of time. And so that's going to end up, yeah, exactly, the moving average is going to end up shifting the way they kind of look on the screen, but it's not going to end up shifting, of course, the underlying data. It's just kind of a computational convenience that we do, or that we assume maybe the brain is doing, that it's changing the size of the window of this smoothing or something like that to kind of maximally get rid of the noise, so to speak. Do you guys have any follow-ups on that? No? Okay.
Well,
cool.
I think it's not, so did we only introduce the rectangular window yet? I watched the tutorial, but I did not pay attention to all the details of the...
Oh, for the moving average. Yeah, I think it's just a rectangular window, and you guys can correct me in the chat if I'm wrong, but I think it really is just like, here's this window of time, and we're just going to average here, and then we're going to move it, and then we're going to move it, and that kind of thing. So there's no like tapering, I believe, in the smoothing. I think it's a little early to talk about that in terms of the signal processing, in terms of the length of the school, but that's actually kind of an interesting point, right? That the way that, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's just, I think you guys should pay attention to the fact that if you use a rectangular window, then there's something unrealistic. That it means at some point, you actually know information from the future, not only from the past. So it's a kind of data analysis techniques.
Yeah, and there's like different things you can do with this sliding window. So I imagine that a bunch of the students who are taking Neuromatch Academy right now, who are taking this course, are coming from more like electrical engineering or mechanical engineering backgrounds, in addition to the neuroscience backgrounds. And so for those of you in the room who have signal processing background, you probably know a lot about filtering of signals and all the different kinds of like smoothing techniques and averaging that you guys can do to get rid of that noise. Cool. And again, see, I apologize for continuing to mute you. No, nothing personal. Okay. So in section 2, could you specify how the vestibular signal is being integrated? Yeah. Oh, hang on. The questions have almost just jumped around. So we'll answer this one first, and then we've got a bunch of upvotes for another one. But yeah, this is a great question and a great answer. Like that, we can just say it's actually literally just mathematical integration. just like you would do in your first level calculus course. So that's what we're doing there. Okay, so
what's the question? Did it mean like we as investigators, how we do that, or the brain, how the brain does that?
Okay. I like your interpretation of the question better. Let's do that. It's not about the math, right? It's about how is the brain able to integrate.
Yeah, how's the brain?
Signals. Yeah. Okay. What do you think?
Well, I don't know. I think C probably has a better answer.
No, I have no idea. Yeah. I don't know the detail how the brain do that. I have no idea.
I think that, well, if the vestibular system works similar to the visual motion system, like the system in like when you go from early visual cortex through medial temporal lobe and then into like lateral interparietal cortex or something similar, and we talk about this in like dot motion, right? And you talk about like the ocular motor system, the holy trinity of eye movements, which is the lateral interparietal cortex, the superior colliculus, and the frontal eye fields. And these areas of the brain for the visual system, we assume have what we call like accumulation neurons, where they have like self-recurrent activity, and they kind of integrate signal over time. And so I would imagine that the vestibular system, which I don't know a huge amount about, but the vestibular system might have a similar mechanism. And so maybe we can eventually get someone in here who actually studies the vestibular system instead of us. I'm a vision scientist by training, so that's where my expertise lies, and multisensory integration, but not visual vestibular, like visual haptic and audio visual.
Oh, sorry. So could I ask how an artificial system, neural circuits, can do the integration? What are the alternative ways to do the integration?
Yeah, I think in general, if a neuron has some time constant, and also the connection okay, basically put in such a way. Basically, if you have some acceleration, you have your speed, acceleration as input, speed as output, then you can work with train a neural network by choosing the time constant of neuron properly and the connection weights properly, then you can achieve it. So in principle, mathematically is not difficult things, but the difficulty may be unclear things where it happens and how exactly the brain does that.
Yeah. And I think also what's interesting is that like the idea of how the brain does this versus like where in the brain this is happening. These are two separate questions, right? So you can come up with this mechanistic. We talked yesterday about like what, how, and why models. So you can come up with this like how model explanation. And then you can go fishing in the brain and you can see, does this area of the brain have that mechanism or not? And then there's this whole debate now about whether these accumulation neurons that we think we've found are actually
Is it okay? Han, can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. But the Megan is disappear.
I'm here.
Okay.
All right. Maybe we're back.
Okay.
All right. Let's try it. Okay. This happened yesterday. Apparently, Crowdcast is not as stable as we thought. Okay. So let's move on then. Better recovery than yesterday, huh, guys? Okay. All right. So let's move on now to our next question. Oh, this is a great question. Can you guys see this? What if we have several models sharing the same behavioral prediction power? How can we select the one that's closest to our brain? Oh, this is a great question. You guys want to take this? I can talk for hours about this question. But you guys go first. What do you think? How can we pick the best one? We've got some answers in the chat too, which are, you know, Occam's razor, but yeah. What do you think?
Okay. First question. The first thing I think we should check is whether these several models
Yeah, that came up yesterday too. And I think that that's going to be a recurring theme is the standard all models are wrong, but some are useful. But it's totally true. Yeah. I really like what you said about the fact that we can use neural data to arbitrate, so that you basically you have these two predictions about which mechanisms and which constraints, which loss functions are the ones that are important, and two models that describe data equally well. And sometimes what you have to do is you have to go fishing in the brain and see which one actually is the mechanism that is the right one. All right. So, C, do you have anything that you want to add to this? Let's see if I can fix the sound while we're
basically the same, that the first step you say whether you can reproduce the low experiment result. The second thing is you say whether it can give new prediction. But there are some times that because the brain is so complicated, sometimes you don't know. There's not enough experiment data to judge whether the model is correct or not. Then this you have to base on your belief. So I think the pretty is very important. So the model is pretty, simple, elegant, neat, and also sometimes make me feel, oh, this model should be correct. And this always happens. And in particular in physics, that's pretty. the model, the successful model like the Newton equation or Einstein's general relativity are very pretty. So the model pretty is also sometimes if you don't have enough experiment data, sometimes at least makes me to believe, oh, this model must be correct. The brain must be working such a way. Okay.
Yeah. We've talked about that too, that like sometimes beauty is a reasonable goal and we can go that way too. Yeah.
Okay.
Could I add one word? Yeah, I think so like model testing or
Definitely. All right. Cool. So unfortunately, we are still working on the sound issue, guys. We don't have a lot of control over that. I'm really sorry. We'll see if maybe Hung, if you want to try reloading again. I don't know. We can try it. Just reload the page and we'll try that. Yeah. All right. So let's go on and see if we can pick a different question here. Oh, we've got a couple good ones here. What do we think? C, there's two that are near the top. One is very technical, one is very philosophical. Do you have a preference? We've got the major difference or major difficulties between modeling neural data versus biological data on the one hand versus like human behavioral data, multi-bandit choices. What do you think? You want to take that one?
Let me think about it. The question is quite long, so. Okay, so if my understanding is correct, so the question is about the modeling neuron data and modeling behavior data. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
think the modeling neuron data, typically when you do this kind of stuff, you will come to down to the neuron and their connections. So you build up a network model. You will, and also your reproducing behavior is typically the neurophysiological behavior and also some prediction of also about neural recording data. But when you're modeling the behaviors, so the model is more like conceptual level. So you may define some units and there are connections and to do something, or even using some probability model, some Bayesian, you don't have to specify how the neural circuit is actually to implement it. So these two type of model is very different. One is down to kind of implementation level, neuron circuits, and another is on the conceptual level. Is to more like kind of descriptive. It's all in the Mars view is like kind of the top level, description level, but the neural data is more to the implementation level.
Yeah, okay, I think I'd agree with that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And we talked a little bit about MAR yesterday, where we introduced the how, what, why kind of distinction between models, and then we also talked about different like layers of abstraction from like neurons all the way up to like people and societies, and then we also talked about MAR's 3 levels of analysis and how all of these are great ways of kind of describing what your model is good for and also what it's not good for. I think I'll add to that though, that for me, I find that modeling, if you're trying to do like an implementation level model, there are ways in which what you're trying to model is in some ways a little bit more concrete. You can see a neuron spiking, you can, or not spiking, you can see like a synaptic current or measure it like with these kinds of instruments that we've developed. But like trying to get at cognitive effects, trying to get at, the example given in the question is this like multi-armed bandit problem. Like, oh man, like the kind of decision-making processes that you're getting at when you're trying to understand what a human is doing when they're trying to navigate a multi-armed bandit. I think that's really like fascinating, but it's also really hard. And so we've got a much less direct line into what the thing is that we're trying to measure, I think, in a lot of ways when we're trying to get to like human behavior. Even when you're trying to do human behavior as simple as like pressing buttons, like here, I show you a thing on the screen, are the dots going that way or that way? Like there's a whole lot of stuff going on underneath the hood in the decision to press like the button for the dots going that way or the button for the dots going that way. Like, what do you see, A or B? So that would be, I think, my follow-up there is like, this is the kind of main distinction that I see between modeling neural data, biological data versus like human behavior data. Yeah. All right. Well, it looks like we've permanently or semi-permanently lost Hong, which is terrible. Sorry, guys. Oh, yay, we're back. Wonderful. Nothing like reloading to get rid of the tech difficulties. And now we keep, for me at least, we keep switching places. I don't know if you guys see that too. So
and switching browsers.
Oh, okay. Can you guys hear Hong now? Hopefully that's the case. So they've got a little bit of a delay. Yeah, perfect. Awesome. Okay. Wonderful. Okay. So we've got some more questions to deal with. This is fun. So let's do the next one. So does the model we learned in today's tutorial suggest that the vestibular signal will be denoised through some brain areas when integrated with the visual signals? Or like the auditory system, which also uses these hair cells to sense the route from the hair cells to the thalamus to the cortex, and the vestibular system is responsible for some process like denoising. So basically, is there a thing in the brain, if I'm understanding the question correctly, is there a spot in the brain or a system in the brain that's doing something that functions like this moving average, so to speak? What do you guys think? Any decision points, any thoughts on that? I think that there has to be, right? That there has to be like, I mean, this is one of the things that we think that, well, so again, I'm going to speak in the visual system because I'm a vision scientist, but this is one of the things that we think lateral inhibition and divisive normalization is doing in the visual system. And I think in all the sensory systems is that by having neurons that kind of have opposing tuning preferences, and they inhibit the cells that have tuning preferences that are opposite their own, that kind of ends up averaging out the noise, and that this can also happen across time as well. That we end up with these kinds of divisive normalization kinds of things that end up doing that averaging in time. I don't know where that is in the vestibular system though. See, sometimes, you know, us people with PhDs, we don't know everything. And so I actually don't know where that is in the visual system. Do you guys know? Or in the vestibular system? Do you guys know?
Actually, I have a question. Is the denoising part necessary in the model? I did not quite get that point. I watched the video. I watched a tutorial video. I'm not sure. Well, I did not think through it, but at first sight, I did not quite understand why denoising the vestibular signal is necessary.
For the
so why we need that? Yeah.
You know, I didn't create the tutorials either, so I'm sorry, I don't know. I think, yeah, so we've got some answers in the chat. That's great. So the denoising step, turns out it didn't help because the signal was so noisy to begin with that it's so unreliable from like a Q combination standpoint that the brain ends up, even after you kind of denoise it, it's still just not useful. And so on some level, maybe the brain kind of knows that, or if you believe in like probabilistic population codes or sampling-based kind of ways that neurons can represent probabilities, that on some level, the brain kind of knows how reliable the signal is. And so even averaging a noisy signal doesn't end up helping. Anybody have anything to add?
Yeah, okay, maybe I comment about it. I think this just is a mathematical way to describe what the neuron does. So we say the neuron is doing some information processing. You can using some say, okay, this neuron is, you say, extracting some time averaged, some futures, which is obtained by average over some singles over time. Or you can also describe, okay, this neuron is actually doing denoising. So basically, I think denoising is kind of terminology. Is a way we try to understand what the neural system does. We're using these mathematical tools. Engineering people has developed denoising, then we use it. But you can also, the same function, you can also, okay, the brain is to extract some info, for example, information over time. So it has the same effect of denoising. So the denoising could be, I believe, is always occurs in the neural system. Yeah.
It's kind of a primary goal.
Yeah, otherwise,
Yeah.
If we don't do denoising, basically our neural system will respond to every instant fluctuations. We'll be mad, right? We will extract some slow futures, some time invariant futures. So there will be some denoising behavior going on.
Yeah, this gets into, I think later in the tutorials, we're also maybe going to talk about expected versus unexpected uncertainty. And I believe it's next week on Monday, that is like the whole day on Bayesian inference and Bayesian ideal observers and how the brain deals with probability distributions and stuff like that. And so I think that this stuff is going to come up at that point, which would be great. So guys, stay tuned for that. I think that that'll be really relevant to these types of questions. Cool. Okay. So we've got another question here. World velocity is computed as optic flow signal minus vestibular signal. Basically, it's like the difference between them. This is a mathematical question. Why is there a negative sign before optic flow? I think it's just because of the backwards thing, that you're maybe going in the opposite direction. I think that that's the reason, but I'm not gonna, don't hold me to that because I'd have to go back and look at the code. It's been a little while since I looked at that, sorry. So sorry, we'll have to skip that one for now, but ask your TA actually. Your TA is gonna know much better than we will for that one. Okay, so let's do the next one. Why do we perceive self-motion only by vestibular signals, but not by a combination of visual and sensory signals? I'm not sure what sensory means here, but let's keep going. In our model assumption, we only assume a pure representation of self-motion from vestibular signals, and it proves to work well in the example, but the data or the design is not enough to explain how we perceive self-motion. Oh, wonderful. Okay, so there's like this whole field that is visual-vestibular integration. And like tons of people who work on multisensory integration of visual and vestibular signals and how optic flow relates to self-motion and how it gets integrated with the vestibular signal. And if you guys have not seen these experiments, they basically involve putting a human or a macaque, a monkey, in a chair and moving the chair around and then like shooting dots at you and like trying to make you figure out where you're going. And then moving the dots in ways that they do or do not agree with the vestibular signals. So that your vestibular signal from like being in a chair on the end of a robot arm where the chair is going this way and the dots make you, your eyes tell you you're going that way and you see like where your heading direction is going to be. So these are actually really interesting experiments and you guys can go look them up. But I think that's maybe what you mean by this kind of pure representation of self-motion. I don't know that you're ever going to get a pure representation of anything from any sense. I think that the world is multisensory. And so maybe C, you want to follow up on this as I know you do multisensory stuff too.
Okay, I agree with you. So self-motion is not perceived purely by vestibular singular, but visual singular also provide a cue for self-motion. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's in fact a pretty reliable signal, right? Like usually when you have optic flow, it's saying that you are moving. Like usually you are the one that's moving, not the world. So there's this idea that you've learned that type of signal from your eyes ends up being a reliable cue for you moving. And so you've learned the kind of association between those things. I'm going to start talking in Bayesian terms if I'm not careful. I got to wait until Bayes Day so that we don't get ahead of ourselves. But there's a whole formalization of how your brain has learned what a particular signal is likely to tell you about the world. And you have these kinds of prior expectations, and then you do the Bayesian inference and you come up with the answer. So I love that we're asking these questions, though. These are like, hold these questions in your mind for like 6 more days, and then you can learn how to do it next Monday. It'll be great.
Could I just add one sentence about this question?
Yeah.
So I think what we were doing to model the train illusion is a very simple model. It must be some simplification of how the brain works. So example that how we can model it in a very simple way. So some of its assumption must be simpler than the real reality. So that's why we just treat like sensory as one input, the vestibular system as one input, and the visual system as another input. Yeah, that doesn't mean we don't think there could be more complicated ways. Yeah.
Oh,
so
yeah.
that's where we start with.
Exactly. And the tutorial today showed that when we do this massive oversimplification, that the model doesn't quite work right. That it doesn't quite actually get it.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is like perfect. It shows that, you can simplify it down and get some things right. And maybe that gives you a really interesting answer, a really interesting story. And that's fantastic. And you've learned what you want. But it also means that, as you guys saw in the outro video too, that there's like that crazy flow chart that Gunnar put up, where it's like, it's not just like, oh, come up with a hypothesis and then like do some cute experiments and then like test your model and then write it up and like, then you're done, yay, and then just go back to the beginning. That's not how it works. Usually,
I really like that. Yeah, I like that. It's not like very beginning we have the best model we have in the world, that we start with something.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
That's a real world.
And then you take your simple model and you start adding stuff to it. And so one of my favorite ways to add to some of these kinds of integration models is to add the idea of causal inference into it, where your brain has to decide, like, should I integrate these signals or not? Or should I segregate them? And so some of actually Conrad, some of his earlier work, like back in 2007, I think, was done with my PhD advisor, and then I followed up on some of that stuff in my PhD, and we did some causal inference and multisensory integration, and so this is one of my favorite questions to think about, is that the brain is constantly like deciding not just how do I put these things together, but like, should I even do that? And it all happens under the hood. Like, you don't make that decision. Your brain does it for you.
The beauty of modeling, I think, is to explore. It gives you the opportunity to explore many, many parallel worlds. Like, they are potentially possible, but there's only one universe, the universe we live in.
Oh, now you're turning into a philosopher. Have you read any of Don Hoffman's work where he thinks that, maybe the outside world is nothing like what we perceive? It's a convenient illusion. But, we should all be philosophers at heart, I think. Cool. Okay. So we have a double question here. The next question that's up is the same as before. So I'm going to skip that one. We've got a question about day one material, which I'm going to refer you to your TAs because I think that they will do a better job answering that. But this question, if you don't get this question asked or answered to your satisfaction, please actually like message. You know what? I'm going to tell you, message Conrad on Twitter and he will answer it for you. And you can tell him I sent you. Okay, this question about the Poisson neuron and the exponential distribution ISIs. Tell Conrad that I sent you, and he has to answer you on Twitter. Okay, and then we've got a couple others. They keep jumping around. Let's see. Can Bayesian inference be used as a tool for transforming sensation to perception, such as vestibular and visual signals in tutorials are inputs to sensation? How to build mathematical expressions to go from sensation to perception. Well, I know how I might answer this, but I'm going to allow you guys to talk a little bit if you guys want to about the distinction between sensation and perception, if there is one. No?
Well, I don't know. I don't know whether it's a real. There is any real differentiation between sensation and perception. It's probably not a real question. It's just an illusion.
Well, I think maybe the difference or the way that I interpret this question, and maybe, you know, whoever asked this question, Rebecca, it looks like if I'm getting this wrong, please tell me in the chat. But this kind of, I interpret this as like the difference between when we encode a sensory signal in like early visual cortex versus like what we see. And so if you see like a visual illusion, at what point in your brain does the visual illusion bit emerge? Can you see that all the way down at the level of the retina? Well, probably not. Can you see it in LGN? Probably not. But then like after that, it starts to get a little fuzzier because then you end up with like lateral inhibition and other kinds of, you know, factors ending depending on the visual illusion, of course. So like the line is blurred then between sensation and perception. And then of course the whole subjective aspect of perception as well, which maybe we don't need to get into here. Then that's the philosopher of me talking. I like talking about, you know, consciousness and subjective perception and all that stuff. So do we think that Bayesian inference can be used as a tool for transforming sensation to perception? That's a pretty concrete question. What do you think? Yes, no. Ooh, maybe we can do a poll.
Okay, so maybe I say something about this. Because the Bayesian inference is a very general framework. Its emphasis on that how the priority is integrated to influence the probabilistic inference. So you suppose that you have a backbone to which can map anything from input to output, and above on this you add in some noise to introduce some probability, then and priority, then you come to Bayesian inference. So in this sense, Bayesian inference can fit everything. So that's why it can be a tool. It's rather than the question could be more specific. How Bayesian inference can be a better rule for us to understand from sensation to perception. I think that if the question asked is this a way, then I will answer that it could be is a very is a proper tool because the Bayesian inference emphasizes on the priority, and when we transform from sensation to perception, priority plays a very important role. That's where the most illusion comes from. Okay, yeah, that's my answer.
You can see what the audience thinks too. Do they think that Bayesian inference can be used as a tool for transforming sensation to perception? Oh, we've got some people agreeing. Yes, no. Come on, guys. Don't be shy. Yeah, I think I like your answer. Thanks. Yeah. So maybe people think yes, no, but this is kind of a bigger philosophical question that it's not just about like, can Bayesian inference be used to describe why we make the perceptual decisions that we do, or to be able to capture or predict the perceptual decisions that we make, but like, is this actually what the brain is doing? So bigger questions. Keep going on the poll, guys. I want to see where you go with that. All right, so it's midnight 01 for me here in California. So we will do maybe one more question here. Does that sound good? And then you guys can go and run off to your social hubs. I hope those are working for you guys. We've got these little virtual rooms set up so you can go wander around and talk to each other in the era of COVID and quarantine. Let's do one more. I was surprised that the train illusion doesn't collapse after a second or two. In real data, do we find that participants resolve their erroneous motion perception after a few seconds, even if the sensory inputs are constant? Having never been in an experimental setting for this or run one of these myself, I actually don't know the answer to that. Do you guys know if the train illusion or other erroneous kind of motion illusions would collapse after a second or two?
No, I have no idea. I think it's an empirical question.
Yeah.
My experience never collapsed. So I have this experience a long time ago when I take a train to my hometown. I was very tired, and I will feel that the train is moving. I'm not sure whether my train is moving or the train beside me is moving. I think hard. I still cannot solve this. Which one is moving? Then what I do, I will look at the ground. I will outside of the train. I will immediately say, which train is really moving. I think our brain does not solve this, even though the sensory input is constant. Is because maybe it's because of prior or something. So this prior is also constant. So you will never, the base impulse theory is constant. So you cannot solve it. You have some extra cue to break this break this illusion. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the way I would answer too. And this also goes into this idea of expected versus unexpected uncertainty and kind of the stability of the environment, so that once your brain has decided, or you have decided that you are moving and the train next to you is not the thing, the environment is not the thing that's moving, why would the world suddenly qualitatively shift? It wouldn't. Because generally speaking, like, the world doesn't suddenly shift to a completely different configuration. The world is fairly stable from one moment to the next, and your brain knows this. And so once it comes up with one interpretation, it's really hard to break that. And this is true for a lot of other visual illusions as well. Maybe you guys have seen the dancer illusion, the spinning dancer, where you can make her turn the other way, or it's like motion from structure from motion. Where you have like the ball that kind of made of dots that looks this way, but then you can get it to flip so that it turns the other way. But it's really hard to make them flip. Once you see it going one way, it's really hard to make it flip in your mind. And I think this is kind of a similar kind of thing, that once the world has one interpretation, why would it suddenly flip? Because it never does that in the real world. It only happens in experiments.
Or it depends on whether our brain has any opportunity to collect new data.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. If there's a new piece of data, absolutely. Then that's a whole new thing. Now you make a new inference and you say, oh, I have new information that I need to integrate into my percept. Yeah. Cool. Okay, guys. Well, it's midnight 05 for me. I think that we didn't get to a lot of questions here. Sorry, guys. But I think in the interest of not dragging this out too much, we could speed through a bunch here if we wanted to. We might stick around in the chat afterwards. But if you didn't get a chance to ask your questions or get your questions answered here, do take them back to your pods tomorrow. Take them into the Mozilla hubs and wander around and chat science with each other in your little avatars. This is the best part of a summer school. for the summer schools that are in person, is to actually like sit down and have a conversation about science. So try to use this time to do that, and take these questions back to your TAs tomorrow and to your pods, and see if you guys want to chat about them there. So I think that's probably it for tonight. You guys have been awesome. Thank you for hanging out and chatting. This has been really fun. So do you have any parting words for the rest of the students here before we sign off? No? About models? How awesome models are?
Well, I didn't know it's so much fun to answer questions.
It is fun. It is fun to answer questions, to talk about science. This is like my favorite thing, right? Is to sit around and just talk about science and models with people. I do this in my free time, which I think makes me kind of a crazy person, but you know. All right. Cool. Well, it has been great. We had fewer tech challenges than yesterday, so that's awesome. Maybe the system is catching up with us. So it was really nice to meet both of you. Thank you for chatting. And I haven't looked at the schedule, but if you're signed up for any of the other Q&As, they will probably be similar to this one. And we'll get to answer lots more fun questions from all of the students. Okay. All right, guys. Well, that's it. Take care. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Hello, everybody. Hope you had a great second day. I'm very happy to be here with three of our guests. So we have Jean-Jacques Orban de Xivry. He is in the Department of Movement Sciences at the KU Leuven in Belgium. We have our Athena Akrami, who is at the Sainsbury Wellcome Centre at University College London in the UK. And we have Aldo Faisal, who is also at University College London, but in the Department of Bioengineering.
Imperial College London.
Imperial, sorry.
We're the competition.
We are friends.
I always get confused between them. I'm so
You're
sorry.
all University London.
But you're both in London, right? There's no two different Londons in the UK. Okay, good. Whew, I got that one right. Okay, so welcome for joining us all. Maybe we can get started with you telling us something about what you do, and so that our students get to know you a little bit. Jean-Jacques, do you want to start?
Yes, sure. Well, I guess to define myself, I can read my Twitter bio, because I'm very active on Twitter. And so it simply says that I'm an engineer working on movement neuroscience in a movement science department at KU Leuven in Belgium. And I think with that, you have a good overview of what I am. So more specifically, I study the process of motor adaptation and how aging affects motor adaptation. I do that via computational studies, behavioral studies, brain stimulation studies, and also starting some EEG studies. So quite a diverse set of tools that I use for my research.
Awesome, thank you. Athena, you already got the chance yesterday, but for those students that haven't maybe dialed in yesterday, do you want to give us a brief overview of who you are as well?
Yeah, sure. My Twitter bio is not very informative, so I can tell you briefly that my undergrad background is engineering, biomedical engineering, but then I got interested, I was interested in brain, but then soon realized that my interest is more in kind of a scientific questions about the brain than just like, kind of an engineering type of finding some outputs from our current knowledge. So then I studied computational neuroscience during my PhD. I worked with attractor models, and then soon realized that I would like to have more kind of a direct hands in the phenomenology of the type of questions I am working on. So I became experimentalist during my postdocs. So now in my lab, we basically have a full loop of designing experiments based on questions related to memory, inference, learning, statistical learning, and then try to set up hypotheses from either mechanistic models or normative models and test them on rats, mice, human, and yeah.
Awesome, thank you. Aldo, do you want to give us your spiel?
Sure. So I'm generally interested in the algorithms that allow us to, generate skilled, interesting behavior. And from a perspective of working on these algorithms, I don't mind whether these are algorithms in a robot or algorithms in a human. What I'm interested in is how top-level constraints arising from the tasks that an organism or a machine needs to execute, how this influences how we should choose algorithms and representations for learning and controlling these tasks. And from a bottom-up end, I'm interested in how physical constraints in the nervous system or in the biology of the systems limit what type of solutions we can pick. And so in my career, I've started working at the very low end of things. I've worked on axons and ion channels. I've worked on insect motor control, then graduated to human motor control and decision-making. And basically, the use of fairly advanced statistical machine learning methods has taken over more and more of my work. And so now we're ended up very much at the cognitive end of working with humans. And the interesting thing is what's important to us is we just don't model things. We also want to build solutions that implement something practical that you can apply in medicine, in brain-computer interfacing, for example. And so for us, this closing the loop with building a system is an inherent part of understanding a system.
Great. So as you know, today, the students learned about how to approach modeling and sort of went through a 10-step guide. Maybe can you briefly share with the students what your approach to modeling is? Where do you start? What do you do typically? Aldo, do you want to start?
Sure. So I think I'm not giving you a textbook answer because it really depends on where you're coming from. Do you have an idea in the modeling domain and that you want to then find a biological system where you can apply this idea and try to see whether the idea captures something meaningful in the real world? I would take a very different domain of where I'm confronting with an interesting contradiction in the data or something complicated in the data that I want to explain in a simple way. So if I'm coming from the theory end, I'm trying to basically reduce the idea to the simplest possible essence so that I can really talk to you about it while we meet on the corridor for 30 seconds. And then so that I can engage many different experts in many different domains, be it mouse biology, be it human biology, and basically see whether it resonates something, whether there's a meaningful application for that. And that's really the first step. Does my abstract theoretical idea have any practical purpose or purchase? And on the other hand, sometimes when you're just confronted with very complex data, you're then asking, okay, what are the underlying simplifying principles that I can apply? And again, here, you need to go back into your understanding of the biology of the system and see what constraints you know about the biology of the system to simplify the complexity of the problem of this data.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Athena, what is your approach?
Okay, so our lab is basically a kind of a systems neuroscience lab. And I know that there are various definitions of systems neuroscience. My definition is that we start from a kind of a cognitive question, right? We are interested in some aspects of the behavior and cognition. And then we try to really kind of break it down into addressable components and then use different tools in order to understand that. I know that, again, the word understanding can be very confusing and can be very, and there is no kind of a convergence about what do we mean by understanding. But like abstracting out some details and kind of being, my example is that imagine that I kind of ask you, how does a pinhole camera works, right? And if you tell me, I mean, you can really just start from the concept of a dark room, right? Like there is a hole and it projects the images into back of the room. You are not going to tell me any more details about what is the material of this box, what is the color of the box, the size of the box, right? So we have to really abstract out some details and really get to the minimal description that explains that system. So in my lab, we also kind of, we're interested in questions about like, how do we learn structures in the world in a kind of an unsupervised manner. And then try to really, we have to, at the end of the day, break it down into smaller steps. And that smaller step sometimes is just like falls back into purely kind of computational theoretical approaches, right? We really would like to kind of have a neural network that is going to learn a simple task in an unsupervised manner. But then, because we are also working with rats and mice and human, we try to find some sort of some aspect of that abstract model that we can collect some data in the real system, and then go back again and modify the original model. So it's a very kind of a constant loop between we gain some intuitions, some insights from generic frameworks that I mean, probably that is very kind of a personal choice. I like normative models. I like Bayesian statistics. I like maybe attractor dynamics, right? And then in that framework, we try to define some questions that can be tested in the real systems, and then go back and refine those original ideas.
Great. Thank you, Athena. JJ, how do you approach modeling?
Yeah, I think for me, it all starts from a question or something that I don't understand in the data, or that does not make sense, either in my data or in papers that I read. And then I'm like, okay, how can I make sense of this result, given what we know? And that's often, for me, the start of the modeling approach, where I'm like, okay, this doesn't make sense to me. It does not fit with the framework I have in my head. If I try to model that, am I able to do so? If I take, a model of like motor adaptation, can I reproduce this phenomena in such a model? What type of model would I need? What are the minimal assumptions that I need to be able to reproduce that? And sometimes it's possible with a simple model to make sense of what was found, and sometimes it's not. And that's often, the start of an adventure. I think I've basically produced many more models that I never published than the ones that I actually published. It's because it just helps me to make sense of things that I don't understand. And so that's really the idea. And the tools that I use then are the tools that are used in my field, often state space modeling, optimal controls, and stuff like that, and trying to make sense of results. Trying to see what do I need to change in a model to reproduce that, or is it even sometimes not possible to reproduce that, which means that I can still not make sense. And that's often the start of a long path towards researching what the answer is.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, I think everyone has had enough time to ask questions, so we'll go through them. So first question is by Sunidhi. Hey, in the tutorial 3.2, thresholding the self-motion vestibular signal, why are we taking the last value of each child's vestibular signal as an estimate of self-motion velocity? Why the last? Okay, I think I have to answer that because I was intimately involved in the development of the tutorial. And the answer is really very simple. The vestibular signal, the raw vestibular signal, is an acceleration signal. So when you integrate that acceleration signal, so you essentially, when you integrate, you accumulate, right, in the acceleration signal, you get velocity when you do that. But it doesn't make sense, really, to choose at a particular time point, especially an early time point. You want to make a judgment after some time of observing the sensory input. And we have chosen the end of the 10-second period of data that we gave you, but that can be something different, of course. You can say, well, maybe it only takes a second to figure it out, and then you can make the judgment after the second, right? So this was a very simple model for you to walk through, and we've made some fairly arbitrary choices if you want. But the idea here is simply that we wanted to have all the possible information available that we accumulate and integrate and make the judgment based on that. Okay. Next question. Why do biological systems have noise? Does it also serve some evolutionary purpose? Okay. Who wants to answer that? Aldo.
I'll go for that. So biological systems have noise, I think, first of all, because noise in any information processing system is a given of the laws of physics. Any single processing component has some form of inherent noise, ultimately coming all the way back from quantum mechanics. In neurons, you have noise because you have proteins that basically are subject to thermodynamic noise. You have noise because signals and synapses are subject to diffusion of neurotransmitters, and you've noise all the way to the level of behavior. The reason why I cannot make an accurate reach very quickly from one point to the next is because you have variability in how you're recruiting your muscles and how the nervous system scales up signals over many orders of magnitudes, from molecules to a scale of a meter. So noise is unavoidable. The question is now, how much of noise that we're seeing in the world of the brain is used for meaningful purposes? So there's this old idea of what we call, and I'm blanking here on the term, Gunnar, please fill in, you know what I mean. It's a sensory enhancement, stochastic resonance. That is a way for bringing low subthreshold signals over the threshold. And there's been some evidence in sensory neurons, for example, in sharks, that show that these effects can be used. More interesting is the use of noise for processes of computation. And here, when you're trying to build systems that can infer things from data, what you're encountering is methods that we call Monte Carlo modeling, and I'm sure you'll hear more about this, as well as so-called inference by sampling. And so these are algorithmic aspects that are powered by some form of random number. So there could be uses for this noise that the brain may exploit to improve things. But ultimately, think about where creativity comes from. Where can you do things that you have not thought or conceived about before? And maybe all our creativity is nothing else but rolling the dice in some form of structured way to come up with new solutions.
That's very thought-provoking. Athena, do you want to add something to that?
No, I agree with all the points that Aldo said. I just wanted to add maybe two comments. One is that the first thing is that the definition of noise. A lot of times when we are dealing with biological system, we call something that we really don't know what is the source. We just call it noise, right? Because on the opposite side, signal is what we know really what is the source. We have the control over, we have a good prediction of the behavior. So we have just more knowledge about that aspect of the information. But noise is just something we really don't know. And if we really dig more carefully into that, a lot of times, I don't know, for instance, like when we are averaging spike trains over different trials, right? We come up with like some average firing rate that would represent maybe average behavior, average output of the brain. But if you really look more carefully into that, there are trial-to-trial variability. And then that at the level of trial, we are able to use that, something that we were calling noise, in a kind of a meaningful manner that would just produce slightly different behavior, right? So that's one thing that we should be careful when we are talking about noise. Sometimes it's just about some unknown information or signal in the brain that we still don't know how to categorize it. And then second is that delving more into the last point by Aldo about creativity, I think like noise, yeah, it's very good. Like some intuition from physics, from statistical mechanics is like when there is this kind of when you are stuck into a basin of attraction, for instance, right? Some thermal noise would just like would push you out of that state, right? It's like something. Sometimes you probably realize that, oh, I'm blanking on something. I cannot really think clearly, right? I'm just stuck into some thought, right? At that moment, you really need noise in order to get out of that state, and that's very important for you to put you some other kind of a new part of the new state space in order to explore other things and not just always getting stuck into your existing state, mental state, or that probably is going to reflect back into some real kind of a low-level biological details. But at the mental state, you need some sort of a kind of a thermal noise to get out of the sticking states.
Yeah, that was a great question, and it's actually like a very active research field as well. People, sorry, I hope I'm not taking the words out of your mouth here, JJ. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, maybe to summarize, you can really see two categories of noise. One is detrimental to behavior, the fact that you cannot reproduce twice exactly the same behavior, even if you would like to. And some, as Athena just mentioned, is really helps you to explore the environment. I think that's really two broad categories. That's a kind of summary of what Aldo and Athena said before.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have another very interesting question. How would you approach data-driven versus hypothesis-driven projects with regards to the proposed guidelines? This is a question of Eugene Tretiakov. Who would like to answer that?
I think JJ should go first this time.
You're on the spot, JJ.
Yeah, thanks, Aldo. Yeah, I mean, it's I think it's a difficult question. To me, it really depends what you mean with data-driven. I think that's not specified. But if you collect a lot of data, what's your goal? Okay, you have a lot of data you want to model, but what's the ultimate goal of your model? I think that's important to decide. If you have a hypothesis-driven project, it means more to me that you want to make the distinction between two or more different hypotheses, and so that the model will tell you, or hopefully will allow to tell you, well, this is possible, this is not possible. So I think it's not especially the last stage of the proposed process that are different. It's really the way you frame the question that is very different. You could use the same model for a data-driven approach or for a hypothesis-driven approach, but it's really the way you frame the question that will be different, I think, in these two type of projects.
Aldo?
So just a bit of controversy in here. I'm going to disagree with JJ. So what I think there's fundamentally different ways of thinking about modeling. So one is what I call modeling, where you come in from first principles and tries to add as few elements as possible to build something that recreates the description of data, generates data the way that is consistent with what you're seeing in the world. And that's very interesting if you want to understand what's the minimum elements, what are really the key features that I need to understand. At the other end, when you're being data-driven, one thing that is very important to me is that we're trying to completely ignore human preconception, what we call the induction bias, of how I think a problem is structured. And instead, basically, let the data tell us what is the most important thing. So I give you an example. Many years ago, we had a question, what are the most important hand movements? And people wrote for 200 years, treatises on what are the most important hand movements. And people say this, and this is the most important hand movement. We actually started 10 years ago to measure people's movements in everyday life with data gloves. And then we found that this movement is hardly ever executed, like 0% of all hand movements are this movement here. And so a lot of our preconception of what we think is important, how we build prosthetics, how we build robotics, is built on assumptions made by humans. And so when I'm data-driven, and I'm decidedly in a different mindset when I'm data-driven, I want to throw out as much as possible about assumptions and use as much as the constraints that I put on how my model fits the data to find some structure in there. But I want to eliminate this human induction bias. And that's fundamentally different from bottom-up modeling, where say, this rule and this rule and this rule needs to be in there, and I want to see whether I can recreate the problem in the data.
Can I add a little bit of?
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, so again, just as a person who has computational background, now running experimental lab, every day we run into this problem of, should we just like collect data and run experiments, or we should first have a full model and then create hypotheses and then go to do experiment? And it's a very hard question. I think the important thing, as both JJ and Aldo mentioned, data-driven approaches are very valuable because we really need to know the phenomenology. We really need to know some output from the system. Otherwise, we just like we will work on based on our presumptions, and that sometimes can be wrong. But the important thing, I think, is that after we collect data, what are we going to do with it, right? Unfortunately, a lot of the experiments, a lot of studies finished after collecting the data and doing a first course of the first order analysis of the data. We stop there. I think that's the critical point, that out of that data, we should then try to create maybe, refine models, create new hypotheses, design new experiments. That's the important thing, not just like collect data, because maybe some of the studies can be divided into categories of how the brain looks like or how the brain works, right? So if we just collect data and we're happy with that, we will just end up having like a bunch of studies that would tell us how the brain looks like under different conditions that we ran these experiments. But if you really want to understand how the brain works, then we have to tie back these data-driven approaches into putting them into some kind of a formal models and kind of a theoretical maybe hypothesis.
Thank you. So I would like to add like a couple of words to this. So I think that whenever you do a modeling project, whether it's so-called data-driven or hypothesis-driven, you always have inherently some hypotheses or at least some questions, right? And I mean, Aldo said like, yeah, I wanted to know what the actual finger or hand statistics are. But I mean, the hypothesis that was out there was essentially a hypothesis long stated that this is among the most, that's your hypothesis, among the most frequent. That's the thing that Aldo tested in a data-driven approach. So in a way, they're not that different. You're just coming into a set of questions with different tools and different from a different angle, essentially. But you always have a question. You always have a goal when you do either of them, either the formal modeling or the data exploration. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Okay, so next. So this is again a question that relates directly to the tutorials. How do we come to the conclusion that the brain actually integrates vestibular signals? Is it possible that it compares the vestibular data, which are acceleration data, and the optical flow data, so velocity data, differently? So is that a possibility that can also be right? And that question comes from Yaswant Avers. Sorry. Who would like? Anyone would like to answer this? So I mean, yeah. So the main reason why we did it this way in the tutorial is essentially because we know that the brain integrates those signals for perception. There's multiple integration pathways in the broader vestibular system. So not just the one that controls the eyes, for example, for the vestibulo-ocular reflex, but also the ones that control balance, for example, that control perception of self-motion, et cetera, et cetera. So this is essentially why we did that. Now, are there other possibilities in principle? Sure. You can come up with an arbitrary amount of different things that you might want to do. Some filter. So integration is just a type of filter, right? So you can come up with another filter that doesn't do exact integration, for example, but does something else and still gives you an idea of what's going on. So yes, there is different options, but again, the goal here was not to explore those options. The goal was for you to go through the individual steps of how to actually think about modeling and build a model. Okay. Can you give us specific instructions or examples for peer programming? Sometimes it feels too time-consuming. That's an interesting one. Okay, that comes from Minu Shin. Does anyone want to have any opinion on peer programming? I mean, from the instruction perspective, I'll start. From the instruction perspective, peer programming is really the ideal thing to do. If you're a good programmer and you're fast with it, does it take more time doing peer programming? Yes. But that doesn't mean that you don't learn extra things by doing peer programming. And there's several advantages of that. One is that in the group that you're in doing the peer programming, you have a lot of complementary expertise. And peer programming essentially is angled or based on the fact that you exchange information, right? You talk things through, you discuss things. So there's a lot of information exchange among yourselves, and this should really increase the learning component for everyone. It also, if some of you are more expert in a certain field, is a really good way of actually solidifying the expertise. There's no better thing to actually knowing whether you have understood something than having to teach it and explain it to someone else. And so it has really multiple aspects, multiple advantages to use the peer program. And yes, it's potentially a little slower sometimes for you, but you will hopefully find out that other times it's actually faster because you would not know on your own what to do and how to approach, and you could get unstuck by your group that way.
And I think sorry, JJ, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, maybe what I wanted to add is it's one way also to explore the way to program, because sometimes you do something in a certain way, and by confronting how you do it with how someone else would do it, you can learn, oh yeah, there's another way of doing it, and maybe this one is more efficient. I think you learn a lot by looking at how other people program, and that can be very helpful, even if you're already at a good level. And I agree with all what Gunnar said. I mean, peer learning in itself is very, very good for you to answer the question of the other participants, because it will really force you to think about how you are doing it and why you are doing it.
So we ran a few years ago a course, or I ran a few years ago a course at my university, which was about biological and machine learning. And so we had people with biological background, not a lot of programming or math experience, and computer science students together. And we ran an experiment. And the experiment was, we pair one biologist and one computer scientist in a pair programming tutorial where they had to solve problems. And then we just let the computer scientists do it on their own. And the biologists we put together in a group with experienced PhD students to help them. So the groups that consistently produced the best results in terms of the grade of the output that they produced afterwards were the peer programming groups. And ultimately, because when you're developing something new, it's not just the software engineering, it's also programming, especially if you analyze data or model data, is also model development. Is that the dialogue forces you to do things. And all I can say, watch the time people spend on the keyboard. You will get better results if you have the biologist having the keyboard in their hand over the highly technical guy, because the technical guy plays back, oh, I need to do this, and just shoots off, while the other one has to sort of think it through and know why they're doing it. And that is a very enriching exercise, especially if you're developing new concepts and new approaches to think about a problem.
Awesome. Okay, next we have a question from Luciano. Was today's simulated data a good representation of the physiological data that would be recorded from the same sensory systems? No, obviously not. We didn't give you actual neurons or spikes that we have somehow decoded. But we have chosen the levels of noise to be roughly consistent with what the kind of noise that physiologists would get in the decoding, for example, if they base it on a small population of neurons. And it's also consistent with perceptual judgment levels that are measured for vestibular motion, essentially. So in that sense, it's consistent, but yes, we did not give you the actual physiological signals, as in the spikes of the neuron. So in that sense, no, it's obviously not. It's not at the right level of detail in that sense. Okay. Next question by Patricia Rubish. How can you actually defend well a mechanistic model based on data which only show correlations and not necessarily causality? What would be the strategy here to avoid making huge mistakes in the hypothesis about the mechanism? That's a very interesting question. And just to preempt again, so we will have, in week 3, we'll have a whole day where you will talk about causality and what it means to obtain causality. But maybe we can already get some impressions here now. Who would like to give it a go?
I'm struggling to think of a mechanistic model, or at least what I mean, or I understand under a mechanistic model, that is just driven by correlational data. Because typically to build a mechanistic model, i.e. where the elements are contributing to the effect that you're observing, I'm thinking Hodgkin-Huxley model of the action potential, you need to do targeted manipulations of the constituents component of the model, i.e. voltage step responses on ion channels, to gain a relationship, and that is necessarily a causal relationship. I'm really struggling to think about a mechanistic model, except maybe now with the COVID times, we have epidemiological models that model the spread of disease. So in some way they're mechanistic if they're modeling interactions between people going to different places. And there we just have correlational data. But again, these are still conditional data sets. So it's not clear to me whether you can have a mechanistic model without, with just correlation-based data.
Yeah, I agree with Aldo. I think also that the correlation is often the result of your model. So you simulate your model and you get different parameters, different outputs, and then you can see whether those are correlated or not. But then you can kind of test as a first step, if I remove that part of the model, or do I get rid of the correlation between these two parameters and so on. But yeah, I also don't see a mechanistic model that would just be based on correlation. I think it can sometimes reproduce correlation as an output. That would be one way to say that the model is actually realistic, because it can reproduce known relationship, but that will not be the input of the model or what the model is based on.
I'm trying to read the mind of the person who wrote this question, and I might be completely wrong, but maybe what they meant was that, like, on one hand we have experimental data, and then on the other hand we want to propose a mechanistic model for that experimental data, and at the end of the day we will just look at the correlation between the output of our model and the experimental data. And while there might be tens of different models that would produce the same type of data, then the level of correlation is the same. How are we sure that our choice of mechanistic model is the right one? And it's a tough question. Yes, there are probably so many models that can be able to produce the same type of results. Maybe one way around that, is to, for instance, produce new predictions from your mechanistic models, or have a knob in order to kind of do some causal experiments after that from the prediction of your model in the real system, right? For instance, if you have imagine that you build a neural network model that would do integration task in a decision making, right? And then so you are kind of creating a mechanistic model for the signal integration, and now you have a knob in order to just like change something in order to, for instance, like the synaptic time constants or the rule of some intermediate brain areas that would change the integration time, and then you can go and manipulate this real system and see whether the output would match again the experiment, the prediction of your mechanistic models. But these are really great questions, and these are the questions that, I mean, all of us scientists at different levels, we are dealing with these questions every day and trying to find the best answer.
Yeah, and remember, a model is an abstraction of reality, right? So in a sense, every time you model, what you do is you emit a hypothesis, right? A model is just a hypothesis. So if you reproduce a certain correlation, that's all the data you have, with a model that's mechanistic, then you probably want to collect more data, make some predictions, and try to see whether the particular mechanism that you propose actually holds true, or whether it is one of the potentially infinite number of other mechanisms that you have not considered that actually is underlying the data. And so as such, when tomorrow you'll learn about model fitting and model comparison comes down to essentially testing between different hypotheses. Each model is a hypothesis, right? And then you can essentially numerically test under certain circumstances which hypothesis better describes the data. Okay, next question is by Ivan Orsulik. How do researchers experimentally confirm signal integration? By identifying a neural pathway and recording the signals on multiple points along the way, and then comparing the actual signal to the predicted values, or something else? Who would like to answer that? JJ, I think you might have an idea. Oh yeah, Athena, go ahead.
No, go.
But JJ, you might have an idea based on the Robinson work.
On what, sorry?
The Robinson work.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert, obviously, in this integration of signals, so don't think I have anything intelligent to say about it.
Okay.
So I think
do you want to give it a go?
I mean, so one type of integration, again, the postdoc lab that I come from, Carlsberg in Princeton, a big part of that lab deals with evidence integration in decision-making tasks, right? The idea is that, for instance, maybe a lot of you have heard or seen some examples from monkey experiments started by Newsom and Chadlin, that there are these random dots moving on the screen, and then there is a kind of a coherent direction of motion in these random dots, right? So they are kind of noisy. Sometimes it's very difficult to understand whether the dots are moving to the left or right. Then you need to kind of collect visual information for a while. You have to stare at these moving dots, and then after some time, you can realize, oh, this is the leftward motion or rightward motion. So you need to integrate evidence, and then this is basically kind of a starting point to think about the process underlying decision making as some sort of integrating evidence in favor of different choices. And so in Carlsberg lab, yes, how can we then, I don't know, look for this integration signal in the brain? They haven't found it yet, and so it's not an easy answer. So the thing is that if you start from models, again, there are neural network models. There are some sort of a kind of a beautiful mathematical models in terms of drift diffusion model. You have a random particle that they move toward something, right? So then you have a kind of a particle that is accumulating evidences in favor of left, and then there are particles that are accumulating evidences in favor of right, and then they are competing until they kind of reach a bound, right? So, and you can translate these models, these mathematical models, very abstract, into some neural network, and you can have different types of neural networks. One network can do all the integration job for you, right? It's just like one layer, one population of neurons. They integrate the input, and the output is basically kind of a ramping signal. But you can have also some models that it's not that one neuron is ramping up. You may have just like different neurons that have some transient activity in different times, and then if you just add another layer to that and integrate all of sum all of these transient responses, you get a ramping increasing. And these are again hypotheses. Based on this hypothesis, you go and you look into the brain. You usually start from finding a brain area that might be important for the behavior, meaning that if you knock it out, then the animal cannot do this integration task. And then once you find that brain area, you go record from the signal and see whether the activity of the neurons show anything similar to this integration, either ramping or having these transient responses that once you sum them, then they look like ramping.
So basically, going back to the previous question, you confirm integration by doing a causal manipulation that effectively tests for the actual integration of the signal versus non-integration, right? And there needs to be clear causation of the signal on the integration.
That's great. And actually, again, just to foreshadow next week's program, you will have a whole day learning about how this works in terms of decision making. So hopefully that will clarify that question even more. We have another excellent question here, and I think that really is an important question. what are the most common biases you can make when building a model? And that's a question by Ravan El-Subai. I would like to give it a go.
I can go. And actually, I was distracted because this question was the first one on my list, and so I was already thinking on that one and not on the integration. So that's, and I actually like that one because what I think is that the most common bias is an experimental bias. It's actually that we are constrained by our own thinking, and we basically, if our lab think that or has some theory that we have developed over the years and so on, we tend to be very conservative and to build models that go together with our own theory. And so I think it's something very common in science, has been studied by many, many people. And so I think, to me, that's a very common bias, that people are basically constrained by themselves.
Confirmation bias.
Yeah.
I fully embrace that as well. I think confirmation bias is the biggest problem. It's either that you want to see your model to work, and very often you forget to evaluate other competing models. A big favorite. And the other one is going back to this thing about why should the brain or biology or whatever evolved our molecular and protein processes that build and make our brain operate, why should you operate the way 20th century, 21st century biologist humans think, right? And I think this operation in human categories can be very, very detrimental, because we can think about building machines in very, very different ways, but biological brains look very, very different from most machines. An engineer or a human who devises a computing device will use copper cables. Nature uses salty water and fat as insulation and cable for building axons. So very, very different solutions. There's a very good reason for that, and we can discuss it separately. But I think we should try to take the human out of the equation to a certain extent. The human should ask the right questions, of course. But I'm just discovering how much bias there is in a lot of things that we're working on.
Athena, anything you want to add to that?
No, I agree with Aldo and JJ. Yeah, confirmation bias is the strongest bias. I mean, that's why that I think. I mean, I'm contrary to that too, but I really advocate, and I keep telling that to all trainees, that let's have at least 2 competing hypotheses at any moment in our kind of a scientific career, right? If we are working on a project on a question, let's at least have 2 competing hypotheses in front of us. They are still very limited. I mean, they are 2 out of probably infinite set of hypotheses, but it's better than 1, because we can then always find some evidence confirming that one hypothesis that we have. So, but if we work with 2, then we refute 1, or kind of, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, in part of the reason why we developed the 10 steps how to model, in particular, the first 4 steps of framing the question correctly and thinking about hypotheses and thinking about ingredients, sort of from scratch, right, is exactly as one way to at least try to overcome some of this confirmation bias, some of the ingrained sort of like preferences that we might have, where we sort of see a phenomenon, immediately we think about, oh, this must be a Bayesian model for sure, because all I've ever done in my career is build Bayesian models, right? So for sure I'm going to use again a Bayesian model, because Bayesian models are magic and answer all questions in the world, right? So that kind of of course I'm characterizing here, but that kind of thinking, that way of thinking is very dominant in the scientific field, not just in terms of modeling, but also in terms of experiments, right? Yeah. You tend to do the experiments for which you have the equipment in the lab, and you tend to think about, oh, what experiment could we do next based on the equipment you currently have in the lab and the expertise you have as a researcher. And very, like, in much fewer cases, people actually step back and just think about freely, what am I interested in, and how could I possibly, what's the questions I want to ask, and how could I possibly approach them sort of from scratch, right? Athena, you want
another thing, yeah, just like I remember in the intro, Megan mentioned a very important point too, that just like fashionable models, right? Some models become fashionable, and then we feel kind of forced to adapt those fashionable models into our studies, and that can be dangerous, right? Sometimes they are important because maybe fashionable is just like something novel right now, right? And maybe they will give us some new insights, some real new insights. But if it's just because, yeah, we want to jump on the bandwagon, and we just like want to say that, yeah, we belong to the club too, that can be dangerous. So another thing, probably, I mean, it reflects more on the whole kind of a systematic biases in how the science is run, which is basically like a lot of labs, they compete for funding and grants, and they always want to create novel experiments. And by novel experiments, then that means that they're not going to finish the experiment one that they started, because if they just like continue that would somehow kind of count as some incremental work, right? Then they want to jump into a new topic, and that this jumping into a new topic again is good, but the side effect of that is that we are not going to have a full picture of the questions related to experiment one before starting the new experiment.
Great. There's a lot of questions here about the sort of technical details about the tutorial. Why did we do this? Why did we do that? So I'm not going to answer all of them, or actually I'm not going to answer any more of them, I think, because there's some other interesting questions here that we should answer before the hour is over, and that's coming up very, very quickly. Just as a reminder that in the tutorials, the specific choices we made for the model were somewhat motivated by the scientific background, by the knowledge of the field, but they were in a degree totally arbitrary and unimportant to the goal of the tutorials. The goal of the tutorials was really for you to walk through each individual modeling step and go from the beginning, from the phenomenon, the question, all the way to a publication in the 3-hour period. And so of course we cut lots of corners, and of course it's oversimplistic. And yes, you can ask many, many different questions about the details about that, but really that is not so much the goal. And therefore I hope that you understand that I don't want to spend too much time on that. So there's one really interesting question here that I think we should be talking about, which is, do you think modeling and experimenting should be done by separate groups or different people? And that's kind of like a provocative question, because all 4 of us on the panel here have both an experimental lab and do modeling at the same time. So who wants to start first?
So, okay, if I may start, being the oldest. So I think, so I like to think of our lab as a theoretical lab that happens to build a lot of equipment for experiments and then runs their own experiments. Ultimately, because sometimes we need the data for our questions, and it's easiest to get them for yourselves. And we work therefore on human systems. I think normally, if you're in a system where you can do both, that's great. But I think a lot of animal systems, for example, in monkeys, in mammals, require a lot of work and understanding and a speciality there. So you will have necessarily some form of differentiation. Of course, there are highly effective computational, rodent labs, but I think the degree of freedoms that you have in asking questions is very different. So that's why I chose to work primarily when we do experiments on humans and collaborate with people who work with animals when necessary.
Yeah, I think it's really a skill or an advantage to have both skills, to be able to model data and to do experiments yourself. If you're only a modeling guy or woman, then you basically are constrained by the data that is available, and you have to ask people to maybe do experiments for you. If you are only an experimenter and you don't have the skill to do some modeling, then you also stuck, because sometimes you won't be able to answer some questions. So of course, it's good to have both skills. Other possibilities to collaborate, of course. And there are many such collaboration, and that should be, I think, make it more advantageous or better for people to collaborate together, because I think that's also the future. We should not be forced to collect our own data, I think we should make data available to others if others wants to play with it.
Athena, do you want to add something?
No, I agree with JJ and Aldo. Just saying that collaboration is probably the most important thing. Even if the experiments are run by different specialized research groups, because technique-wise, it's just impossible. As Aldo mentioned, it's difficult for a lab to do everything in different species and at different scales and levels. But the important thing is to collaborate and think together. That's probably that's the critical thing that unfortunately is still missing from a lot of research groups. But we all need to think about that. And a lot of theorists also still are kind of isolated, and they do the work on their own. And then a lot of times they don't understand maybe the experimental works. Experimentalists, they don't understand the theoretical works. Just like these, the communication should get stronger and fostered, basically.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Maybe just one thing to add is that at least as a theory person, it is often detrimental when you're too far removed from the data you're trying to model, because you do not correctly understand the constraints and the difficulties that have led to the recordings of the data, what the data actually really means. Like people recording from the brain of animals, like what are the constraints? Like, why is the data not cleaner? There's all kinds of different considerations. You think you're somewhere with your electrode, like how sure are you about this, etc., etc. And so really having a close interaction within the same person, or maybe across different people, between experimentalists and modelers, I think is absolutely crucial for the advancement of our field. Okay, so we're coming up to the hour, and I think we had a tremendous discussion here. Would any of you like to say some final words before we wrap it up?
Well, maybe we shouldn't be fooled by the model. Sometimes, if we're too disconnected from the data, we should also trust the data and not only the model. I think that's important.
I think, especially in the age of deep learning, this is a very wise words. But I think what gives me a lot of comfort for the future is the amazing amount of really good questions I've seen, both in the question thread, but also in the chat here. And keep asking questions is probably the most important thing, whether you do modeling or do other things in your life. And it's the right question asked that makes a much bigger difference than just a model applied.
And that will be very useful in your brainstorming as well
Yes.
later for the group projects, because that's exactly what you're supposed to do, is just ask questions in all directions.
Yeah, I'm really extremely positively surprised by the questions, the level of questions. That is very exciting. Yeah, continue that. These questions are exactly the questions that we that are maybe one stage or two stages kind of more advanced than you. We every day ask, and just bring them into your brainstorming sessions and think about different project topics. We'll start today, so bring them into your pods and discuss them with your TAs, with your mentors, and just continue throughout your career.
Perfect. Thank you so much for those final words. I hope you enjoyed the Q&A. Thank you for joining us, JJ, Aldo, and Athena. And